You're listening to a podcast of spurious morality.
Hello and welcome to a podcast of Spurious Morality. I'm Johnstone and I am joined this week by Jimmy.
Hello.
And I'm joined by Greg.
Stevens!
Is this you trying to say that you're the boss?
If you want to interpret it that way, go right ahead.
So it's this lineup, which means this must be a season by season episode, and we've hit a bit of a milestone. It's season 10, hooray! So we're going to bring back the second and first Doctors for an anniversary special, almost a year too early, and celebrate it that way. Because why not? We're on to season 10. So obviously your spoiler warning is season 10 of classic Doctor Who. And I like this run. I think this is the strongest run since season 7. 8 and 9 talked about the ups and downs of both of them. But I do think that we get a little bit more consistency throughout this season. So I'll kick off by asking you both what your favourite serial of this run is. So you go first, Jimmy.
Well, before I rewatched everything, I was expecting to be torn between the Three Doctors and the Green Death, but on the rewatch, much as I love the Three Doctors, Green Death easily beats it. It's definitely the highlight of the season for me.
It's an absolutely fantastic story, and it kind of it's almost like a last hurrah for this unit team. We've no Roger Delgado, sadly, no Master, but everyone else from the unit family gets to have a jolly good run around in this one, and seeing the Brigadier sort of out of a unit setting is always quite nice. Greg, what about you?
I agree with you that this season has more consistency to it, but I don't know if we agree on what kind of consistency that is. But that consistency is broken with The Green Death, which is easily the best story of the season. Like, there isn't even competition for it in my mind. It's excellent.
I do love The Green Death, but I also love The Three Doctors, and I also love Frontier in Space, and nobody else loves Frontier in Space. So I think for the sake of giving it a shout out that it won't get anywhere else, I'm going to settle on that this time, for reasons that I shall explain when we get a little further on. But we will start with the first story, which was The Three Doctors, it kind of set the precedent for doing anniversary stories, multi-doctor stories. In hindsight, it's a pretty wild move. And I really, really like the way they do it here. This is a proper unit-era Jon Pertwee Doctor Who story that the second, and sadly to a lesser extent, the first Doctor just happened to be involved with or brought into. I quite like the fact that beyond the fact that these other two Doctors are there, it is actually just another early 70s Doctor Who story. And I think that works really well. It could very easily have looked backwards or brought in the Daleks or brought in the Cybermen or something like that. But actually, we've got an original villain. You could argue the stakes are perhaps upped a little bit. There's quite a lot of Time Lord involvement, and the Time Lords are under attack and all that kind of thing. But ultimately, this is just a story that fits very neatly in between the Time Monster and Carnival of Monsters when you're doing a marathon. it isn't particularly over the top. It isn't particularly milestone-y. It's just the Three Doctors, and I quite like that. So, Jimmy, tell us about the Three Doctors. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, for me, as much as I really love the Pertwee era as we're going through it at the moment, and it's been a highlight for me watching this series in order. I think I've seen all of it before, but not particularly in the right order. And so, much as I love it, though, I've got to say having Troughton and Hartnell back is obviously the highlight for me as a huge fan of the 60s Doctor Who. Troughton absolutely steals the show, and it's sad that Hartnell couldn't be in it more, but it's brilliant that we got what little we did instead of, it could have easily been made a year or two later and he wouldn't have been able to be there at all. But I love that he gets that last line of, I shudder to think what you'll do without me, which seems like such a fitting end for his Doctor. It's a bit like when Chris Eccleston left and he got the, you know what, you were fantastic, but so was I. I mean, it's just nice to see these two underrated Doctors sort of get that final line acknowledging how good they were. And so that was a highlight for me as a Hartnell fan. But yeah, I do love the story in and of itself. And I think it's not the best of the season because obviously the Green Death, but it's brilliant. It's got plenty of faults, but like the gel guard design for a start, but some of it really works well. Like the strange looking effects for the antimatter blob thing actually works really well. Like it looks weird, but it's sort of meant to because it's meant to be this alien other universe thing. It's like it shouldn't look like anything that makes sense. So I think that worked really well. And once again, the dynamic between Joe and the Doctor is such a highlight, both in terms of the continuing arc of her sort of loyalty to the Doctor versus his constant plans. Like this time, he wants to lure the thing away from Earth and he doesn't want to put her in danger. And that becomes a real big thing through this season, right through to the last story. And also, in terms of her dynamic with the Doctor, her dynamic with the second Doctor, I think even though you didn't really get much interaction between them, her and Troughton really clicked well. And they made such a great companion and Doctor combo together for the brief time that they were there. So that was nice. And yeah, other than that, you've got the whole Omega and the Time Lord history being developed, which is another thing that I really like. And Omega does get a bit hammy, and the mind monster thing that he fights Pertwee as looks a bit silly, but the concept is brilliant, and it's really well handled that they developed this character and developed this story with him. Um, and I just love the silly little things about the story as well. Like the mind monster thing looks silly, the gel guards look silly. You've got the jokes about the silicon rod and it says no admittance on the door that's just by itself, but it's a fun story, and I think that's what was needed for the celebration. It does a good job of celebrating the history of the show, but it does a good job of the story in itself, and it's a good bit of fun, really. I mean, the only thing I can really say is it would have been so much better if maybe Hartnell had been well enough to appear fully, or apparently they wanted to get Jamie back instead of having Benton have such a big role, but he couldn't come because Fraser Hines was filming something else. And, all these could have beens that would have made it better, but what we did get was well worth doing and quite enjoyable in and of itself. So, I mean, sure, you can mourn what we didn't get, but I think what we did get is worth celebrating.
I think you can probably mourn what we didn't get with near enough any Doctor Who story at some point, but I understand how obviously with this one it matters a bit more because it is a celebration and it is Hartnell's final ever appearance as the Doctor and so many other things. I think the one brilliant thing this story does is it kind of sends the Doctor and Joe off and lets the second Doctor be UNIT's scientific advisor, and we get the second Doctor treating the Brigadier as he treated the Brigadier in Invasion, and his appearance is there. But the Brigadier has moved on. The Brigadier has worked with the third Doctor and is used to working the third Doctor's kind of way, even if he doesn't always agree with it or whatever. So I quite like the sort of, it's almost like another what could have been. What if Troughton had have done another season, and what if the second Doctor had been UNIT's scientific advisor? And we just get a little glimpse of it, and I absolutely love that. Greg, what are your thoughts on Three Doctors?
Well, speaking of the Brigadier, was he having a really bad day, or did he have a late night the night before this all kicked off or something? Because he seems to be about one negative event away from having a complete nervous breakdown throughout this entire story, and I'm not entirely sure why. But it makes for an interesting dynamic, and you're absolutely right about Patrick Troughton, taking on that role of scientific advisor and just approaching it from a much more uh, anarchic standpoint than Pertwee's doctor ever does, which I think shakes things up a little bit. I think the Three Doctors is a great example of a Bob Baker, Dave Martin story, which we've talked about before, which to me is usually great idea, shame about the execution. I love episode 1 of this. I think it really builds up the mystery and the tension. I think the antimatter monsters are legitimately threatening. I think it's genuinely a bit frightening how unstoppable they are and how they just seem to destroy everything in their path indiscriminately. I think it's really interesting that they work the Time Lords into it, and then of course you bring the other Doctors into it. Like the first episode really feels like this is building up to be this spectacular story, the likes of which we haven't seen before, and then you hit the middle two parts, and it's mostly just the characters running back and forth in Omega's domain, getting captured and escaping, and captured and escaping, and running down the hallway of the Omega's castle, and then running into gel guards and running in the other direction, and then trying to run another way, and no, there's gel guards. And oh, it goes on and on and on and on and on. And I don't know why. I mean, I've seen this story so many times, but that really jumped out at me this time. um, but the mythology aspects of it help save it, because Omega is a new creation at this point, and it's really interesting to get a window into Time Lord history. Of course, the vocal performance by Stephen Thorne is absolutely phenomenal. Like the anguished scream that he yells out when he takes the mask off is excellent. I mean, it's so good in concept. I just, by the time you get to episode 4 and you have to sit there and watch every single character slowly walk through the singularity and disappear, it's just like, what are we doing here? But yeah, I enjoy it despite that, because it is the Three Doctors, because we do get to see Patrick Troughton and William Hartnell return to the role. Hartnell's last ever acting performance, in fact, and even though he couldn't do more because of his health, like you can still see that old spark and personality in him, even sitting down and being up on the monitor. And I love the story of it's sad, but it's heartening in a way that when they called to inquire about his interest, like they first talked to him and he was like, oh, of course, I'll do whatever you need. And then his wife had to talk him down and call him and be like, he's not really healthy enough to do that, because he loved the character so much and he loved the role so much that he was jumping to appear in the show one more time. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, it would be a much lesser production without Hartnell, and even though he does only get a scene or two per episode, it's the way he's brought into it is just absolutely fantastic, and the fact that he's there as kind of almost the boss of the other two Doctors, I think it's just great. It's a fantastic dynamic, which unfortunately we don't get to explore more, but it's there, and I think not just the story, but Doctor Who in general is better for it. I really do like the fact that Hartnell got to establish some kind of relationship with other Doctors in a multi-Doctor story.
I
It
just
just
find it
worked well.
I find it interesting, because in the classic series, and we only see him twice, here and then recast in the Five Doctors, but they treat the first Doctor as, the elder statesman, the wise old man, and then much later in the new series, like Stephen Moffat correctly observes that actually he's the youngest one of them and he shouldn't be the most experienced and the wisest. But at the time, like they just, well, he's this dignified, older character, so of course he's the one in charge. I think it's interesting to compare the two.
Well, that's kind of because the classic series sort of had a respect for him, whereas Stephen Moffat's portrayal obviously very clearly had no respect for the character or his history. So, there's that.
I think it has been approached in many different ways, and I get that, yes, the first Doctor is actually the youngest. Maybe he isn't the oldest one, but I also like the fact that in terms of actor and how long the character's been around and where the character stands, he is kind of the grandfather of all the other Doctors. It is a nice dynamic. It perhaps doesn't make sense. I think you were right there, Greg. But yeah, I really do enjoy the way he's portrayed in this and in the Five Doctors. It's absolutely brilliant. I think Three Doctors was one of the very, very first stories that I saw. So I really, really enjoy it. I've got an awful lot of time for it, but I think a lot of that is very genuine nostalgia. I'd just sort of discovered Doctor Who, and all of a sudden there was this story that had the first three Doctors in it all at the same time. And I think that's probably why I picked it. I think the Five Doctors came immediately afterwards. And it's a truly great story. It's a lot of fun, and it is, as I said before, very of the era it was made in. So you get a lot of that Pertwee charm in it as well, and it's nice to see other Doctors brought into that era. And I think perhaps that's something we don't get with Five Doctors. It's not so much a Fifth Doctor story where the other Doctors turn up. It's everyone gets a bit more of an equal slice of the pie. But yeah, it's a great story. It's really enjoyable. So we'll move on. And next up is one that I have to admit I wish I liked more than I did. I appreciate that it has some absolutely brilliant moments and it's a great concept, but it's just never quite clicked with me. It's Carnival of Monsters. And it's everything about it tells me I should like it. There's some absolutely brilliant dialogue. It's a Robert Holmes story, therefore, by default, there's a level of brilliance there before we've even started. But it seems to go on a bit. I find the stuff inside the miniscope to be a little boring, maybe, but I really enjoy the stuff going on outside the miniscope. That seems to be where the really interesting stuff's happening. So I won't rattle on about it anymore. I will pass over to Jimmy. What are your thoughts on this one?
For me, this story, it seems to change every time I watch it. Sometimes I love it and sometimes I don't. And this time it was sort of fell in the middle. Like, I really enjoyed it, but I could see a lot of areas that it should have and could have been better. Like, I think the alien masks for the functionaries, not just the main aliens, but the sort of those specifically drone sort of ones, looked really bad. Like, they should have been able to do something better. I mean, even in the 70s, even on a low budget, that just was not good enough. And the entertainer costumes, like, I mean, obviously they're meant to be flashy and ridiculous, but I think they went a bit too far in that direction. Like, it looked completely bonkers. Like, if they had a normal sort of realistic looking setting to appear in, it might work well as a contrast, but they purposely made the planet so dull that it just jars too much seeing them like that. The other thing is, of course, the Drashigs. It's a cool idea, but they don't really execute it very well. I mean, the thing I always can't help but think when I see this story, and you see that tiny 2 seconds of there's a Cyberman in this thing, is they should have had the Cybermen get out instead of the Drashigs. Turn it into a Cyberman story. Like, have you worried that those people on that ship are going to get converted or something, and have a bit of a race against time to stop that from happening? It's just a bit of a shame that the Drashigs, who are the centerpiece of the centerpiece monster of the carnival, as it were, they're a bit rubbish, which is a bit of a shame. But um, for me, the story's still good. The best part for me is once the Doctor gets out of the machine and he starts to be involved in that story in the outside. That's when the thing comes together. I think they sort of dragged it out a bit too long, and they should have had the Doctor or Joe or both get out sooner and figure out what's going on. And leaving it to the last minute made it a bit, I don't know, it made the two separate sections of the story not seem to fit well together. And the other thing I can't help but notice is the continuity wise, you've got that thing about the ship. It's 1926, and Joe's like, "Oh, that's 40 years ago," which is like Usually, the unit dating gets stuffed because things are supposed to be later than it actually was, but this time it's sounding like Joe's from the 60s instead of the 70s, which is a really weird decision. And the other thing is the Doctor's mention of the ship being, oh, it was as famous as, what was it, the Mary Celeste or the Titanic or whatever. It was as famous as that in its time. This ship went missing and it never came back. And then at the end of the stories, they're like, oh yeah, and everything that was in the miniscope got sent back to its right place and time. So how was the ship ever famous as missing then? It never went missing. It got sent back right as it left. So just a weird thing that they didn't bother to, or didn't notice to deal with that continuity. But I think these lots of little faults just sort of dig at the story, and sometimes I can look past them and enjoy it. But this time, they really got to me. It's good, but it should have been so much better.
I think on that last point, I'm going to use the wibbly wobbly, timey wimey get out clause. But yes, I do know what you mean. I do think that the Doctor spends too much time in the miniscope, and then he eventually gets out, and you think, oh, great, he's out of the miniscope. Something's going to happen. There's going to be movement on the outside story. He near enough immediately goes back in. And it's just, I really wish it had focused on the outside world a little bit more, but I fear for that to happen, this would have to turn into a 6-parter, and no, 4 parts of Carnival of Monsters is absolutely, definitely long enough. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Greg, what are your thoughts on it?
I'm in the same boat as both of you. I don't think it's a bad story. I mean, as you were saying, it's Robert Holmes, so there's always a baseline level of quality there. There's some interesting things. I mean, like Vorg and Sherna are fun characters, and the stuff on the ship, at least at the start, is interesting. But I think the problem is that, first of all, the world outside is defined as being dull and gray and boring. And I mean, while I see, what he's going for metaphorically there with the audience and with television and so on, it has the effect of making the story boring. I don't, it's very hard to pull off any kind of idea in which, like, something is defined as being bad or difficult to watch or boring or whatever, because even though that's sometimes the point, it's still bad or difficult to watch or boring. And the scenes outside of the miniscope are just absolutely dull. And then the ones inside the miniscope just go on for far too long. Like, it's a nice little mystery right at the start, like what's going on, why are the Doctor and Joe on this ship, like how's that related to the outside world? But then to this other planet rather. But then they explain it. They're in this thing and they're being watched, and it still goes on and on and on and on. And then they finally escape the ship, and it's like, all right, now something's going to happen. And then they climb around inside the miniscope for a while, and it's like, okay. And then they go to the world of the Drashigs, which is a really cool, they're one of the best looking alien monsters the show ever did. Like, they were really scary to me when I was a little kid. But again, like, that whole sequence is just, it doesn't add anything to the story. It's just like, well, here's a monster because we need something to be happening. And it's like, it doesn't have any like particular effect or meaning or anything. It just gives, some sort of motivation for them to run faster when they're going through the innards of the miniscope. And yeah, it's an ongoing theme in this season that the stories are just padded out to a ridiculous extent. And that's true of the 2 4-parters. So we're about to get into the 6-parters, and it doesn't improve until the end, unfortunately. But I don't want to sound like I'm slamming this story, because again, like, there are a lot of good lines, like there are some really interesting concepts, like the themes of it are pointed and interesting. Like it's clearly written by an intelligent, talented scriptwriter, but the execution.
I quite like the sort of world building that goes on in this one. It's it's the planet called Interminor. I can never remember, but it feels like a genuine functioning society, and I like the sort of comedy bureaucrat characters that it produces, and it really does feel like this is taking place in a galaxy. It's not just some little settlement or some little society. This is an entire alien world, and it does feel like an entire alien world, even though it's only a couple of dodgy, even by the standards of the time, looking sets. Yeah, it feels like there's an awful lot more that this story could pick apart and focus on, and maybe its focus is actually in the wrong area. I'm less interested in the miniscope than I am the sort of world that's going on around it. And because it was done on one or two sets, it does come across as a bit boring. It's not amazing and action-packed as you'd want something like that to be. But I definitely think there was actually more of untapped potential there than there is through the miniscope part of the story. The Drashigs were great, though. Yeah, they were excellent monsters. I kind of latching on to what Jimmy was saying. It would have been great if it was a Cyberman story or an Ogron story or just something like that. But I do like the fact that this story, one thing it does do is successfully realise another alien monster. That's sort of quite an achievement, really. And I think the Hooniverse is better because of Drashigs than it would be without them. And they've popped up in Big Finish a couple of times, and they've been used fairly effectively there. So yeah, I'm glad we have Drashigs. And as Greg said, they do look fantastic. They are very well realised in a story where it's fair to say not much else is, really. We'll head on to the next story. So Frontier in Space. I feel as though I might have to do a bit of defending here. It is slow. It goes on. It's capture, escape, capture, escape, capture, escape. But similar to Carnival of Monsters, actually, there is a lot of world building. There is quite a bit of tension between tension to be found in the story of the building tension between the humans and the Draconians. And I quite like that Draconians, they feel like a properly realised society. They're not villains, they're just aliens that inhabit the same universe and are sort of on speaking terms with humans in the future. I like the fact that Earth is sort of portrayed in a certain way, and that, there's a president, and that it is sort of the seat of what feels like this big galactic empire. It feels like a really immersive setting. And it's because it's a good old-fashioned space opera, and there is a lot of travelling. There is a lot of travelling about by spaceship. I feel as though we do get to see quite a bit of this universe. It feels big. It feels epic. It also feels quite slow. But that slowness is kind of eased up a bit by the appearance of the Master halfway through the story. Suddenly the dynamic changes and it's going somewhere else. And the same happens in the final episodes when the Daleks make their appearance. It's only a bit of a cameo. It's only really setting up Planet of the Daleks, and you could actually argue that this is part 1 to 6 of a 12-part story. So yeah, it's flawed, but I do find an awful lot in Frontier in Space to enjoy. But I am now looking forward to hearing you two rip the living daylights out of it. Jimmy, you go first.
I obviously don't like it as much as you do, but I don't think it's as bad as a lot of fandom do say it is. I think the hardest part of it is that it does feel a bit dragging and boring early on before the Master comes in, but I think Delgado does such an amazing job for his final story that he just brings it to life and makes it so much better. It is too long in a way that, like, if they cut down the first part to just one episode before Delgado arrives and give him a bit longer on the scene, I think it wouldn't feel as slow. Like, he does such a brilliant job with the Master always, and it's so sad that his final story wasn't like a planned, actual, intentional exit for him or something, and that we never got that. But he absolutely shines, even in what would, if he had got that later, would have been, an average story. He just really makes it work. And I mean, I love the way that he talks about the Doctor and Joe, and he's like, my two dear, such dear friends. And it's like, you believe it. Like, he wants to conquer the Earth or the galaxy or whatever, but he does care about the Doctor, and he's even come to care about Joe to an extent, which is sort of a surprise because all the later Masters with later companions, it never feels like they care about the Doctor's companion as anything other than a tool to hurt the Doctor or get in the Doctor's way. But with Joe and Delgado's Master, it really seems like there's an actual chemistry and a dynamic there, and that's something I love about the two of them together. And yeah, he absolutely lights up the story, and especially that scene where he's telling one of the Ogrons something about, well, no ship would ever go this way, and the Ogron's like, we're going this way, and he just flies into a rage. I know that you. It's brilliant to see him sort of unravel a bit because usually he's so calm and collected when he's playing the role. It just brings the story such a good highlight when he's just, what are you talking about to the Ogron? Just, it's so good. And I think the best thing for me about the story, well, no, sorry, two things to go. I think one of the best things is at the end when the Master tries to hypnotize Jo and she resists, and then he tries to use the sound thing that makes you see whatever you're scared of, and she sort of resists again. And it's just such a good thing for Jo's arc that, you know, in her final, compared to her first story where the Master has her nearly blow up Unit HQ, by the last time she meets the Master, she's resisting his hypnosis easily and she's quite competent and capable against him. And I think it's brilliant that we got that in the classic series. Like, often the companions did get, shafted by the storyline, as it were. But Jo here just, yeah, she's capable and confident in and of herself, and she can resist the Master, and it's such a good thing to see. And like you were saying about the character development and the story, the world development, I loved the way you had Draconia and Earth against each other, and you actually got that confrontation between the Draconian prince and the general, and it's like, well, you blew up my spaceship. Well, here's, I couldn't communicate with you, but what about this? What about that? And they sort of actually hash things out, and by the end, they seem to be, not friends as such, but they seem to be accepting of each other and to be happy to work together and form that joint mission to get to the Ogron planet. And I think it's good to see something like that, because usually when you've got the, war mongering hotheads in classic Who, it's like, it's always just shown, oh, they're bad, they're stupid. But this one, it's like, no, you've both made mistakes, but you can overcome them, you can work together, and you can, do the right thing again. And I think it's a good thing that we actually get a storyline like that. So yeah, I mean, sure, this story is a bit overlong and a bit dragging in places, but I think it's brilliant despite that.
The war storyline in this, and kind of how it is resolved by the prince and the general sort of talking and realizing they've made a bit of a mistake, it's kind of echoed in sort of a war that's part of the backstory to Babylon 5 as well. And I kind of like to think that somewhere in Big Finish Land, someone's thinking, we could do Babylon 5, but it's Draconians. And that could be interesting. That could be something worth exploring. I genuinely feel that this is a setting that doesn't get fairly explored. It's sort of quite big in terms of where it places the Earth and the Draconian empires and that kind of thing. I feel as though there could be quite a bit worth mining there. And it's not quite been investigated in expanded media as much as it could be. Delgado's great. As you said, anything Delgado's in just kind of automatically gets raised quality-wise. This is no exception whatsoever. Greg, what are your thoughts?
I mean, there is a lot to like here. I like, as you were just saying, the world building of it. I mean, it 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 fleshes out like what the landscape of the galaxy looks like in the future in a way that very little Doctor Who does. Doctor Who historically has not really been at all concerned with any kind of consistency of its presentation of the future. I mean, we've got, 1,000-page Bible-sized volumes of trying to reconcile all of the different historical information that we've seen over the years in Doctor Who. But I agree. I wish they'd gone back to this one more because it's really interesting and it's really fleshed out. And it seems like there's opportunity here for other stories to be told. I mean, I think if we could do, Big Finish, if we could do a whole box set of stories set on Peladon, and some of those were very good, you could do the same thing with this setting as well. I think, like Jimmy was saying, Roger Delgado in this is fantastic. I mean, he's always fantastic, but he really, brings an energy to it. And at least when he's on screen, there's always like something like, okay, well, I can't take my eyes away from this for a second because I want to see what he's going to do next. My issue with the story is that if it was a four-parter, it might be one of my favorites of the era, but the first four episodes of this story, the entirety of the first four episodes of the story, are the Doctor and Joe being shuttled from prison cell to prison cell. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they're apart, sometimes they're on the moon, or the Doctor's on the moon, sometimes the Master is there, sometimes they get taken out of the prison briefly to go meet with, the leader of whoever has imprisoned them at that time, but it's just prison to prison to prison to prison. And, as much as I agree that like they really fleshed this world out a bit, what we see the most of in this world is its prison cells. And that's just not very interesting. And like episode 5, once they're finally out of this, it's not even capture escape. They're just captured after they're out of this sequence of, being shuttled from prison to prison, and they're actually out and free and able to act. Then the story opens up, and then it gets really interesting. But that 4-episode prologue is just like, oh man, like again, like so much of this season is just padded out, and this story is no exception. And it's a shame because like by the time you get to the end and all of a sudden the Daleks are in it, and like that's easily the most surprising Dalek reveal we've ever had, I think. I mean, that's fantastic. I love Delgado like just having no respect for the Daleks at all, like doing a mocking Dalek voice, calling them stupid tin boxes. Like I love that. I think it works really well. I wish that the following story had actually like been in the same setting as this one instead of being its own weird, almost unrelated thing. But we'll get to that. Yeah, Frontier in Space. It's again, if you could just lop off 2 of the episodes from the beginning, I think you could have a close to a classic. But man, it's tough to get through that first hour and a half.
I mean, we've talked about 6-parters before, and yeah, I don't think there's a single one in the Pertwee era that doesn't feel padded in some way. Which, when you think about season 7 and its 7-parters, a lot of them are actually quite fast moving, and they go from place to place. Sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally. But yeah, all Pertwee 6-parters seem to feel an awful lot longer than the 7-parters at the start of the era. And it's so strange. It's almost like they've forgotten how to kind of structure something that's a bit longer, because a lot of 60s 6-parters and even the 60s 12-parter doesn't feel overlong. It doesn't feel like it doesn't deserve that runtime. And the war games we talked about, it's 10 parts that just absolutely fly by. It's no matter how much I will defend Frontier in Space, I can't overlook the fact that it is horrendously slow. It does not move an inch for, you're quite right, it doesn't move an inch for 4 episodes. But yeah, its story lengths are really a problem at this point. I have to admit, I do think it's a problem that gets somewhat slightly improved on during season 11, which is obviously the next one we're going to talk about. I think season 11 6-parters perhaps have something a little more to offer than 8, 9, and 10s. But yeah, it's fair to say now that there's no denying it. As we're going through all of this chronologically, Pertwee 6-parters are a problem. So let's talk about another one, Planet of the Daleks. This, to me, just feels like the default Terry Nation blueprint for a story. Like, if somebody fed everything Terry Nation ever wrote into some kind of AI and asked it to write a Terry Nation Dalek story, Planet of the Daleks is what it would kick out. So, Jimmy, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it's definitely the low light of the season. It's as you say, very generic and churned out, and I'd have to agree with all that. It's I've made a lot less dot points to talk about with it than any other story in the season. Over half of them are quibbles with weird mistakes and stuff with the plot. Um, I will say first, I don't think it's got as much connection as it should have, perhaps, to the previous story. Like you were saying, they could almost be a sort of single 12-part like the Daleks' master plan, but it's just like the Daleks are in both, but other than that, the connection is quite slim. I mean, it's a bit like saying an unearthly child and the Daleks are the same story because you've got the cliffhanger at the end of the radiation meter, and they're separate. Like, I mean, you could argue they're together, but it doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, I'll start with a couple of the things I did like about the story. First of all, obviously, as the huge Hartnell fan, hearing the third Doctor and the files talking about Susan, Barbara, and Ian is just such a nice little bit of nostalgia and really heartwarming. So that was nice. And I love at the end the conversation the Doctor has with Codal about. Oh, sorry, not at the end. The conversation where he has about bravery and bravery not being not being scared. It's being scared and doing what you have to. And then the conversation at the end, I forget whether it was with Codal again or with one of the other files, but the conversation about not glamorizing war when you go home and talk about it. And yeah, that sort of stuff's good. Very Pertwee era, but in a good way. But then you've got the rest of the story, and it's pretty rubbish and lots of weird quibbles and plot holes here. Like, first of all, the molten ice. So, water? Like, they do try to talk their way around it, and it's got some special magical property that makes it not actually freeze, but it's still frozen cold. And it's like, yeah, but come on, molten ice. It sounds like you're talking about water. It's a bit stupid, isn't it? I can't get past that. And then you've got all these other little plot holes, like the part when they're in the lift going through the Dalek base, and the Doctor goes in and he wants to go up, and it's like, oh no, the Daleks have control of the lift. I can't go up, but I can go down. It's like, hang on, if the Daleks have control, why are they letting you go anywhere? It should be stopped and you should be able to get out. It's like, where's the logic in, oh, the Daleks have control. We can't go up, but we can go down. And then the bit where they're flying up in the hot air balloon sort of thing through the thermal vents or whatever, it's just weird that the Daleks don't think, oh yeah, turn off the air and let the Doctor and the files fall back down and splatter. I mean, it's just weird that no one thinks of this. And then you've got the bacteria. The Daleks have this huge plot point of, oh, we're immunizing every single Dalek and every single slave worker against the bacteria. And then one of the Spirons goes in and releases the bacteria in the room, and it's like, no, we can't let it out. You you've already vaccinated your entire staff. Why can't you let it out? Like, wasn't that the whole point of it, to let it out? It's just, yeah, really terribly written, full of plot holes. It's weird that no one picked it up or no one did anything about it. It's just, yeah, so much stupid mistakes and stupid logic. It's just a shame. Otherwise, this season is really brilliant throughout, but this story is the one that really lets everything down, I think.
You do wonder if they perhaps under-edited Terry Nation, because at that point he should have been considered the safest pair of hands there is. He was by far the most successful writer working on Doctor Who at this point. Like you imagine they just thought, oh well, Terry's doing a Dalek story. He knows them better than anybody. Let's just let him get on with it. Maybe that's where all of this comes from. But I agree, it's an incredibly clunkily written story, and it is a real throwback to earlier 60s Doctor Who, because Terry Nation is still writing for the same show he wrote for when he wrote the original Dalek story, whereas everybody else has moved on for 10 years. Yeah. Greg, your go.
That is exactly how I would describe it. It's Terry Nation, like, not realizing that the show has moved on from where it was when he first wrote for it back in the early 60s. It's written in that old, very serialized kind of Flash Gordon style that Terry Nation was fond of. the characters are all the finest cliches. Um, it, there's it's 6 parts, but there's really not much particularly interesting that happens. Like I kind of like the idea of the Doctor getting trapped in the TARDIS and having his own machine like potentially become his tomb. Like that's kind of interesting, but then it kind of just begs the question of like if the TARDIS is so big inside, why did he run out of air after like 5 minutes? And how is that little thing of like 2 oxygen tanks or 3 oxygen tanks going to supply? Even if it was working, how is that going to keep him alive for more than like 10 minutes? I I think the best way to express how I feel about this story is to explain how I first saw it as a kid. Growing up in the U.S. in the '80s, Doctor Who in Chicago was shown in the omnibus format on our public television station. So we didn't get the individual 25-minute parts. We got just the whole thing presented in one chunk with all the credits and all the cliffhanger reprises edited out. So a 4-part story would be about 90 minutes long. 6-part story would usually be divided into 2 parts for airing. They'd show the first 3 and then the last 3. But the one thing my local station did not do is they did not show black and white Doctor Who episodes. They only showed the color episodes. So I didn't see any of the Hartnell or Troughton eras for a long time, which, by the way, was why I liked the 3 Doctors so much, because I actually got to see William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton, which I hadn't been able to do outside of that and the 5 Doctors. And they just wouldn't show any black and white. And of course, back in the time, a lot of the Pertwee era only existed in black and white. So, I didn't see a lot of season 7 and season 8. And then for a long time, episode 3 of Planet of the Daleks was only in black and white. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6 were in color, but episode 3, black and white. And so, sticking with their policy, my local station showed Planet of the Daleks with episode 3 just edited out. It just wasn't there. It went from the end of episode 2 just straight into the start of episode 4 and didn't make any mention of it whatsoever. And I think it is a testimony to the quality of Planet of the Daleks and Terry Nation scripting that for a very long time I didn't even know anything was missing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can't disagree with that. It's an interesting one. Very little happens during those middle episodes, and like there's some point in the story where more Thals turn up, and I couldn't even pinpoint when that is because all of the Thals are just so similar. Like there's the occasional sort of each one gets a label, I guess, the stubborn one, the brave one, the pretty one. But honestly, like there's no kind of anything going on there. I suppose the one thing that this story is notable for character-wise is it gives Jo another sort of hinted at fleeting romance in the same way that Curse of Peladon did. And I guess that we are now quite heavily signposting that this is how Jo is going to leave. Jo's exit is going to be sort of romance-based. Which, of course, it is in the very next story, The Green Death. So after largely ignoring Unit for the season, we go back and we have a Unit story. I really like it, Green Death. It's a very good story. It's a solid story. It's perhaps the best 6-parter there's been so far. I know I've just bemoaned them, but actually, Green Death's quite good, and it does move at a fair old pace. It develops, stuff happens to sort of change the landscape. It isn't just a capture and escape run around. There's maybe a little bit too much of men arguing in an office, but otherwise it's a really great story with some really great characters, and it gives us a decent companion exit, which is still something we don't get to see an awful lot of around this time. We haven't seen a good companion exit done really since Fury from the Deep. You could argue the War Games is quite good, but it is more focused on getting rid of the Doctor, as opposed to Jamie and Zoe, who kind of just get bundled in a TARDIS and are seen back where they came from. Liz never got one at all. So it's nice to see that Jo does get a decent exit, and you actually feel as though a companion's exit has some emotional ramifications for the Doctor, which you haven't had for quite some time. So, The Green Death, you both said it was your favourite story of the season. Tell me why. Jimmy, you go first.
Well, to start with, it's just so brilliant overall. Like, I mean, I've got a whole bunch of dot points, as I always do, to talk about, and there's only one thing in the entire story that doesn't work, and that for me is at the end when one of the giant maggots turns into a giant fly, and the giant fly looks terrible. They realise the maggots amazingly, and the giant fly looks more like a dragonfly than an actual fly, and it just looks so ridiculous and silly. It's the one fault in an otherwise pretty much perfect story. I mean, the whole thing centers on Jo so well in the dynamic with her and with Cliff, and she's sort of seeing him as a younger Doctor, and the Doctor being sad to lose her, and he even gives her that line about "I'm offering you all of time and space," and it's so sad to see. Like, I mean, it's brilliant that Jo gets a happy ending, and it's so tragic for the Doctor because like he's gone from in her first story, oh, I don't even want her, and only keeps her because the Brigadier's like, well, you've got to fire her yourself, and he can't bring himself to do it. And yet by now, she's like clearly one of his absolute favourite people, and he wants to travel with her forever, and she doesn't want to anymore, and it's just heartbreaking for him. Yeah, it's such a brilliant story as well, but I think the dynamic between the Doctor and Jo and Cliff and the Doctor and Cliff is just what really makes it great. But yeah, you've got the rest of the story. You've got the brilliant environmental message, which could still be done today and be relevant. And then you've got the whole, yeah, everything with Jo and the fledgling flies the coop, and the Doctor sees her as a sort of assistant, but she almost maybe is implied to want the romance thing because of the Cliff dynamic. And then you've got the Doctor finally getting to Metabelius, and you get that a bit of a silly runaround of, just no dialogue, just him running back and forth and being attacked by the monsters. But it's nice to see him finally get there, and it's nice that the plot points gets revisited in the next season. And yeah, just the dynamic again with the Doctor and Professor Jones, and he's even though he's obviously never met him before, he's also very highly thinking of him. Like when he gets that line about, "Oh, you were brilliant for your age." Oh, and then correcting himself to explain the age you live in, and it's just so good. And the Doctor being even jealous at points, like that bit where Joe's sitting up waiting for Cliff, and the Doctor just immediately is like, "Ah, Cliff," and just starts distracting him with all sorts of nonsense to get him away from Joe, and really comes across as jealous. And again, the Doctor's disguises are hilarious as well. Maybe hilarious is going a bit far, but it's very funny, especially Yates's reaction to the washerwoman disguise and them sort of taking out of each other a bit. And yeah, Stevens' boss is such a great villain and such an interesting idea, and the way he sort of goes a bit nuts after he tries to control the Doctor and he couldn't do it, and you get that whole dialogue about freedom from freedom, and I just think it's such a well handled story. And yeah, you get to the end, and then you get that really everyone's happy, cheery party ending. The Joe's getting married, and the Doctor just sculls his wine in one sip and turns and buggers off while everyone else is still enjoying themselves. It's just sad to see him just wander off and all depressed, and at the end of such a optimistic ending, and you see him just heartbroken, and it's really a tragic ending for him and for this whole 3 season long era that they've had together. It's just, yeah, I think they handled everything apart from that fly really well in this story. It's brilliant.
I think that The Green Death kind of lives and dies on the fact that Professor Jones, Cliff, is such a great character, instantly likable, and a lot of the tension in the final few episodes is brought about by the fact that he's been bitten by a maggot. He's suffering from this condition that's already killed a fair few characters in the serial, and you really care about him. Like he's a character that popped up at the start of the story. You really want him to live. It really matters, and it's because you've kind of followed Jo through that process of coming to like him in quite a short space of time. I think it works really well. I think it's excellently done. Personally, I'd have quite liked him to have been introduced earlier in the season, maybe doing some work for UNIT or whatever, and we could actually have seen his and Joe's relationship blossom a little bit on the Earth-based stories. But that's not how telly was made back then. It's never going to happen. Greg, what are your thoughts on it?
I agree with Jimmy. I mean, I think the story is pretty much brilliant. And like you were saying too, it's maybe the best Pertwee six-parter. I mean, it would be this or Mind of Evil for me. But as I've been watching, these 4 seasons of John Pertwee, and after having 3 consecutive stories set away from Earth and away from Unit, like to come back to Unit in this story just feels right. It feels like natural. It feels like returning home. Like when the story opens, like the doctor's just there, like still working for Unit. Like there's no explanation that like, oh, I've just decided to stop by for a while before going back to explore the universe. Like it's just like this is where he's supposed to be. And I think Pertwee stories in space just don't really work very well. And I don't know if that's a consequence of, the start of the era being exclusively on Earth, or if it's the writers never really getting their heads around how to do like more pure outer space sci-fi stories or what. But Pertwee on Earth just works so much better. And you can really see it in this story because, for one thing, you've got, the more expansive cast. And while unfortunately you don't have Roger Delgado, like this story recognizes that, not only are the Doctor and Joe like, principal characters, like so's the Brigadier, so's Benton, and so's Yates. And they all have significant parts to play in this story. And that's, when you've got 5 characters who you can move around and do things with, it can make a 6-parter be a lot more impactful and a lot more eventful because you can spread them out over the setting and have everyone getting into different types of trouble. Like bringing Yates in as the man from the Ministry is a great idea because he hasn't been in the story up until that point. And after Richard Franklin wasn't in the 3 Doctors either, you think, oh, were we just done with Yates? And then, oh no, there he is, and now he's got a whole subplot to deal with. Yeah, the maggots look fantastic. The plot, the plot is so like environmentally conscious. Boss is such a cool villain, and like I love that the story never loses sight of the fact that Boss is a computer program. Like even as it has the suave megalomaniacal voice, like no, it's still a computer, and the Doctor can still trick it like he could any other machine. And yeah, I mean, as a final episode for Joe, I mean, it's, I mean, for me, in terms of up until this point, in terms of a companion departure story, it's this or Dalek Invasion of Earth for me as the best ones. Like, I mean, I love the way the chase ends. We talked about it quite a bit, but I think the difference between this and the chase is that, the chase, like when Barbara and Ian decide to leave, we kind of understand that they've been wanting to get home, throughout their entire tenure on the TARDIS. Like most of the chase is not like thematically setting up that they're about to leave. It's just at the end they finally have their opportunity to get home and they take it. Dalek Invasion of Earth, on the other hand, like actually goes out of its way to set up a little bit of the relationship between Susan and David. But I think the evolution of TV storytelling between Dalek Invasion of Earth and Green Death means that we get a lot more depth to uh, Joe and the professor's relationship. And you really believe by the end of the story that the two of them are in love. I mean, now, granted, is it, oh, they're going to get married right now, like after being together for like 2 days? Yeah, I mean, if you step back, that does feel a little hurried, but you really buy into that relationship. And, we'll talk a little bit more about Joe here in a bit, but like, this is her best story. Like she's not only is she given a happy ending and given someone new to go off and save the world with, and not only does it like describe does it parallel like her relationship with Cliff to her relationship with the Doctor. it it also like shows her like evolving as a character, like right at the beginning when when she defies the brigadier and says no, like protecting the earth, protecting the environment is more important than whatever ridiculous thing you're going to have me go investigate. Like I have to do this. And of course it turns out that that's where she was going to go anyway, but like she's becoming a more independently minded person. Like she's actually learned from the doctor and she's branching out, and it's such a wonderful contrast between this story and how she was introduced. Like I love this story to pieces. It's one of my favorite Pertwee stories.
It's been mentioned that obviously the whole like environmental theme and story going on there is very relevant to now. But actually, when you think about it, arguably Boss has become more relevant in the last year or so than it ever has been in the past. The whole idea of sort of being led by AI and that kind of thing. And, we're in an age now where there's a huge debate over AI and whether it's a good thing and what should its limitations be in terms of art and music and all that kind of thing. It's are we really that far off a company sort of letting a computer make every single business related decision? And is it possible that the ethics of that could get shaky? I think the idea of Boss is very, very, very 2023, and I think that it's a rare example of Doctor Who really getting the future right. Um, it's just quite an interesting thought. Yeah, it's an excellent story, and it really does set up Joe's exit very, very well. And I'm kind of glad that we do get a good Pertwee companion exit. It's a shame that we never really got a goodbye between the Doctor and Liz, and obviously Sarah Jane outlasts the third Doctor, and you could argue she's better known as a fourth Doctor companion. So yeah, it's good to get that proper sort of Doctor companion parting during the Pertwee era. So we'll just, before we disappear, we'll just sort of very quickly talk about Jo. I think she's gone through a huge development over the course of the three series that we've spent with her. I think that her relationship with the Doctor has always been a delight to watch, although he was absolutely rotten to her in season 8. We've talked about this before. And I suppose watching through it, it does feel like that kind of settles and their relationship does develop, and there's no big specific storyline about it. It's never really building up to anything. It's just they get to know each other better and they become better friends. And I really, really like that. So just quickly before we disappear, talk to us about Jo Grant now she's leaving us, Jimmy.
I think it's brilliant how much character development she got, as you say, through her time. Like going from her first story and being, easily hypnotized, nearly blowing up unit. The Doctor doesn't even want her there. And then 3 years later, you've got, this highly competent and capable woman who does her own thing and is willing to strike out on her own and say no to the Brigadier and the Doctor at the start of the story, that she wants to do her own thing. And everyone cares about her, and she's so, such an intrinsic part of the era that it feels like, how are they going to go on without her? I think watching the stories all in order has really helped me with her. I always used to think I love Jo, but I think, I thought that she was a bit overrated. Like, I did love her, but I thought, both Liz and Sarah Jane work better with the Doctor, the third Doctor. And while I still do think Liz was underrated and should have got a better exit and was pretty great, and I do think I'm one of the rare people who thinks Sarah Jane worked better with Pertwee's Doctor than with Tom's as a character. Obviously, better chemistry with Tom, but as a character, I thought she worked better with the third Doctor. But seeing all Jo's stories in order, it's like she's the third Doctor companion. She really makes his era what it is. It's between her and as Jo and Delgado as the master and all the unit crew. It's just such a, yeah. They say the unit family, and it really is. And it's sad to see a part of that family go. Jo is absolutely one of the best companions there is, and it's brilliant to watch her develop and change over her time in the show. And come to such a brilliant conclusion in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. It's arguably one of the most developed doctor companion relationships at all, and it's great how it's kind of there's no plan there. I don't get the impression that there was ever this, oh well, the doctor's going to be a bit sort of hostile to her during her first series, but then after that relationship will develop and they'll become best friends. None of that was there. It just happened very organically, and I think that's why it works so well. Greg, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy has it right there. Like it's very interesting to watch her develop over the 3 seasons. I mean, I'll be honest. Like, watching through the show again. Like, obviously, I've seen Katie Manning's era. God knows how many times in my life, but like, I didn't like Joe when they introduced her, and not because of anything Katie Manning was doing in her performance or anything like that. Just the idea behind the character, like the cynical, like Liz was too smart. Like, we need to bring in someone who's not as smart so the doctor can be, look smarter. And it's like, really, like that's what you're doing. And they really play that up, like in Joe's first season, is that she's, she's kind of dopey sometimes. Like, she doesn't know what she's doing and she makes stupid mistakes. And it's like, and she gets into trouble really easily and she needs the doctor. It's just like, like I don't, why are we going back to this like damsel in distress sort of characterization when we just had like this brilliant scientist? But thankfully they figured out that that was not good, and they developed Joe over the subsequent couple of seasons. And by the end, I mean, she's a great character. Like, she has a wonderful relationship with the doctor, both on screen and I know John Pertwee and Katie Manning were very close, and you can see it on screen. Like, they have just this wonderful, like, you know this wonderful on-screen chemistry together. And you can see that these two people just really like each other and really like being in each other's presence. And it comes through in the writing and in the performances. Like, it she really turns into a definitive companion by the end. And like I was saying, by Green Death, she gets, again, maybe the best departure episode of the entire classic series. Like, really, like, she's treated so well by the story. And it's just like, man, like, if we had done this from the beginning, like, I would put her up in the, maybe she could be in the conversation for me for the best companion of all time. But because of that first season and the way that they treated the character, like, I have a hard time making that argument. But man, like, by the end, like, yeah, I mean, I agree, she's the definitive companion of this era. Like, it's really a shame to see her go. Like, it's genuinely emotional seeing her leave.
And I do particularly like that now Big Finish are obviously doing this sort of run of adventures with an older Joe. She meets the Doctor not that far after this for him, but for her it is 50 years later. It is Joe Grant of the present day, Joe Jones, I should say. And I quite like that that's being explored, and I quite like that he does get more time with Joe. She just kind of experiences it the long way round. It's a run I'm looking forward to kind of there being more of. We have the first 3 stories so far, and it's sort of beautifully handled the death of Cliff, and obviously, sadly, the death of Stuart Bevan. And it really feels like it could go on to be something quite special. And I've heard people say that maybe it cheapens this ending, maybe it cheapens the. I don't think it does at all. I think it works sort of quite nicely that actually Jo does get to meet her Doctor again, and her Doctor gets to meet her again. But we'll leave it on that note. We'll be back in the not too distant future for season 11, where things change quite a lot. Sarah Jane's introduced, obviously. The Sontarans are introduced. And the third Doctor goes on to regenerate. I'm hoping that's not a spoiler. The third Doctor regenerates at the end of season 11. Who knew? But meanwhile, I will say goodbye and thank you to Jimmy.
See you next time.
And I will say goodbye and thank you to Greg.
It's been fun. We'll see you next time.
We'll be back very soon with more Spodcasting. Goodbye now.